This week, Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders has often been criticized for not speaking enough about his Jewish background and anti-Semitism. So on Monday, he surprised us all with an essay titled How to Fight Anti-Semitism. We'll dive into what he wrote and bring you up to speed on fresh conflict between Israel and Gaza. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So, Bernie Sanders, the 78-year-old Democratic socialist running for president, has long towed a weird line with Jews. Among the small but vocal group of progressive Jews, he is respected and liked as an example of Jewish progressivism who is unafraid to criticize Israel. Among centrists, Sanders is looked at with caution for, well, his criticism of Israel and his perceived lack of Jewish identity. And among some centrists, and definitely right-wing Jews, it's hard to get over a guy who is okay throwing around the word socialism alongside a general fear of progressivism. In a way, it's strange that we live in a time when a Jew can run for president of the United States and have popular support, just not really popular support from other Jews. I've heard everything from concern that Bernie is married to a non-Jew to worry that he only cares about being Jewish when he can use the weight of Jewish history to say, as a Jew in political arguments, and also the straightforward observation that, yeah, Sanders doesn't talk a lot about his background. Which in and of itself could do with the fact that Sanders likes his privacy, or prefers his message to be totally universal, or that he's from a generation that really didn't talk about things like the Holocaust openly, so that's the attitude that he sticks to. All of this is a way of saying that it is kind of a big deal that Sanders wrote an essay called How to Fight Anti-Semitism for the progressive magazine Jewish Currents. But substance is important, so let's take a closer look at what he said and what some of the responses have been. Just to note, I'm going to point out some notable bits of the essay, but if you'd like to read it in full, the link is in the podcast notes. So like many Jewish articles and thought pieces right now, Sanders opened with recalling that it's been a year since 11 Jews were murdered in the terror attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. The terrorist was a white supremacist who blamed the Jews for non-white immigration to the U.S., and Sanders points out that rhetoric about an immigrant invasion, which was echoed by the Tree of Life shooter, had been very common across right-wing news sources and repeated by President Trump as well. So it's clear throughout this article that the majority of what Sanders means when he says anti-Semitism is right-wing, white supremacist anti-Semitism. And his message is that anti-Semitism doesn't exist in a vacuum, and that the fight against this bigotry is tied to fighting against all forms of bigotry. He writes, quote, "This wave of violence is the result of a dangerous political ideology that targets Jews and anyone who does not fit a narrow vision of a whites-only America. We have to be clear that while anti-Semitism is a threat to Jews everywhere, it is also a threat to democratic governance itself. The anti-Semites who marched in Charlottesville don't just hate Jews, they hate the idea of multiracial democracy. They hate the idea of political equality. They hate immigrants, people of color, LGBTQ people, women, and anyone else who stands in the way of a whites-only America." End quote. But then things get a little derailed, though not necessarily in a bad way. The essay is called How to Fight Anti-Semitism, but most of it is actually devoted to explaining his position on Israel and the Palestinians. His point in clarifying his Israel position is because, according to Sanders, Republicans falsely accuse progressives of anti-Semitism to divide Americans. So Sanders goes on to restate that it isn't anti-Semitic to criticize the state of Israel, and then says, quote, "I think it is very important for everyone, but particularly for progressives, to acknowledge the enormous achievement of establishing a democratic homeland for the Jewish people after centuries of displacement and persecution. We must also be honest about this. The founding of Israel is understood by another people in the land of Palestine as the cause for their painful displacement. And just as Palestinians should recognize the just claims of Israeli Jews, supporters of Israel must understand why Palestinians view Israel's creation as they do. Acknowledging these realities does not delegitimize Israel any more than acknowledging the sober facts of America's own founding delegitimizes the United States." End quote. Now, what's fascinating here, as tons of Jewish commentators have pointed out, is that what Sanders is saying here is, according to a multitude of studies about American Jews, precisely how most American Jews view Israel. Most are centrists who support a two-state solution, which Sanders continues to advocate for as well. And notably, though Sanders has been criticized for criticizing Israel, he hammers home to his progressive supporters, many of whom are anti-Zionists, that Israel does have a right to exist. So many people have been taken aback at how centrist Bernie's stance here seems to be, despite his reputation as a progressive icon. But he does conflate the fight against anti-Semitism with a Palestinian state, saying, quote, "The struggle against anti-Semitism is also the struggle for Palestinian freedom," end quote. Now, on the whole, the essay has been well received, but not without criticism, of course. Batya Ungar-Sargon, the somewhat controversial opinion editor of The Forward, tweeted about the attacks on Orthodox Jews in New York City that have been increasing over the past few months. The attacks have not been tied to white supremacists, and in fact, the perpetrators have mostly been Hispanic and African American, which complicates the narrative of anti-Semitism mostly being a threat to Jews from the right wing. Sargon said, quote, "If your plan for combating anti-Semitism is ignoring the daily terrorizing of our nation's most visible Jews every day in the liberal bastion of New York effing city, hashtag keep it," end quote. And even Jews overseas are paying attention, with Binny Gutman, the president of the European Union of Jewish Students, tweeting that, quote, "I like Senator Sanders. It's great to see him focusing on anti-Semitism. It's also okay to criticize the Israeli government, but having just one paragraph on the title, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, and the rest on why it's okay to criticize Israel shows how flawed the conversation has become," end quote. On the lighter side of this story, when the essay went live on the Jewish Currents website, so many people tried to access it that the Jewish Currents server crashed. So naturally, everyone joked that Sanders broke the Jewish internet, with one person tweeting, quote, "Peak Jewish guilt is when you go to read the Bernie article again and feel bad about putting strain on the Jewish Currents servers," bringing the Jewish Currents Twitter account to reply, "Don't worry, Bubala, the servers are back." Now, to our last story of this week, to bring you up to speed on what's going on in Israel as this podcast goes live. Over 190 rockets have been fired from Gaza into Israel, aimed as far north as Tel Aviv, after the Israeli Defense Forces assassinated a high-level terrorist leader in Gaza. Early this morning, the IDF got a precise airstrike into a single room in a building in Gaza, killing Baha Abu al-Atta, a senior leader in the Islamic Jihad terrorist group, and his wife. At the same time, Islamic Jihad headquarters in Syria were targeted as well. The IDF and Israeli government say that al-Atta was behind many of the rockets fired from Gaza over the past year and had plans for serious terror attacks on Israel. As a result, Islamic Jihad has been firing rockets all across Israel, leading to a level of lockdown not seen since the Israel-Gaza war in 2014. It remains to be seen whether the situation will escalate to a full war, but complex politics are at play in Gaza. Gaza is officially controlled by the terrorist group Hamas, but Islamic Jihad has been undercutting them and gaining control over the past few years. So there's a case to be made that Hamas helped sanction the assassination of al-Atta, and at least today Hamas has mostly stayed out of the rocket firing. They may join in, but Israel is trying to send a message through Egypt to Hamas that they got al-Atta, Islamic Jihad fired some rockets, and things can go back to being quiet without escalating further. For now, hundreds of thousands of Israelis are in or preparing to go to the bomb shelters. Several have been injured, but so far, no deaths. And to give you a more intimate idea of what that means, Amy Spiro, the digital editor for J Insider and formerly a reporter for the Jerusalem Post, tweeted that, quote, "My cousin texts to say that their 1-year-old just took her first steps inside the home's reinforced security room after the air raid sirens. Celebration and fear intertwined." This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.